You know, what's
The fun
a
of
no?
it.
Are we all set? Okay. I'll go ahead and get started. The idea is the same. I'll try and limit how long I talk so that you have lots of chances to ask questions. The first page of your handout is placed there by way of context. So some of the things that our office has been working on are addressing areas where faculty satisfaction is somewhat lower, either as compared to a peer group or compared to their satisfaction with other things about this campus. And one of those was actually the transparency of policy for promotion, and so that was the focus of our last workshop. Another area had to do with mentoring. And it turns out that pre-tenure, people felt pretty well cared for. And then after tenure, they felt like there was no feedback, there was no mentoring. And so what we've been trying to do from several different angles is make sure that people have access to good feedback during that next part of their career. So one of the things that we've done is make sure that when we're talking to chairs and academic deans, that we're talking about mentoring, we're talking about annual reviews. And so what I've copied here is just the campus policy. And it says you should get an annual review, all the way up through the associate ranks. In practice, we're well aware that this takes many different forms and may be so informal it's not recognized as such. And so I include this in part so that you know that we're working from multiple angles. We are making sure chairs and academic deans know that they should do this, and also so that you know that if you request one, you're well within your right to ask for that. So it gives you a little bit of power if you say, I know that everyone should get an annual review. Could you give me some feedback? So the other thing that we tell chairs, and this second part of page 1 comes from, it's a combination of a presentation that we gave to chairs at the start of the year. We do sort of a new chair orientation, and an event that we call a chair chat. And these are topically organized, and chairs from across campus can sign up when they're interested. And we do one on mentoring mid-career faculty. And so this is what we tell them. We tell them that mentoring should be broad in scope, it should be long-term, that it's forward-looking, and it's not the same as an annual review. And we tell them that chairs and the other senior faculty in the department are responsible for this. So all of this to say that should you wish to have mentoring, annual reviews, and other kinds of feedback, on the administrative end, I believe that chairs are willing, and there's also a perception on their part that you've earned the right to be left alone. So it may take on the part of associate professors initiating the conversation, but it's not going to be the first time they've heard about mentoring associate professors, and they should be open to it in the various forms that it takes. So then if you turn to the other side of the handout, this is what I've created for our conversation today. I was asked to write a chapter, it's been about a year and a half now, with one of my junior colleagues, and it was about, I think it was about getting tenure, but it was from the idea that we would write it as mentor and mentee. And so it's a little tongue-in-cheek, and we tried to be funny. And our paragraph on mentoring is called, Are You My Mother? And it sort of sums up this search that you do pre-tenure. You're looking for just the right person to take you under their wing and tell you how to make this work. And I think as you get further along, mentoring is rarely like that. You're not looking for the mothership to tell you exactly what to do. You've gotten tenure, and now it's more about finding the multiple sources of information that you need in order to be sure that both the planning and the output and the decisions that you're making are consistent with the expectations of other people in your field and other people in your department. So I've listed here as sort of step 1, find out what types of feedback you need. This really depends somewhat on the individual, somewhat on your unit, and how much you have to work to get that kind of feedback, as opposed to how much is offered up whether you want it or not. And those are structural things. So the answers may be a little bit different. I think they're also different by field. They're different in terms of the kind of case you're thinking of presenting for promotion. They're different for personal reasons too, because some people would like to work alone. Some people would like to be part of a cohort. Some people want to check in periodically. And so those things have to do with personalities and how you work most effectively. And I think there's an element of work-life balance here too. Whatever your home situation is, that may also determine the degree to which you want to interact in these various types of situations and the kinds of questions that you're asking, the kind of support that you need. So one type of feedback is peer-reviewed feedback, and that can come in a lot of forms, right? But if you start to think of mentoring in between the lines of those article reviews, it is feedback, and it can be useful. That's an example of very impersonal, very formal feedback, but it is a kind of mentoring. So if you start to connect that to what you're hearing on campus, and you see some common ground, it's probably good advice. Never mind a review or two and the strange things that pop in here and there. But if you're starting to hear something over and over, for example, in my own case, I work on Spanish linguistics. When I publish in journals that don't do just Spanish, I often get the question from reviewers in the first round, okay, but why should anyone else care? And they don't say it like that. But what they're asking me to do is connect this with the big picture. And you see that kind of thing enough and you get better at it, particularly if you're mindful of it. In the context of a career trajectory, it's exactly the same thing. You want to articulate, why does someone outside your field care? And so you can see some valuable feedback in terms of career planning, even in that one very detailed example. I've talked about career planning, and I think there's an important distinction here too between planning and feedback. You might want feedback on your plan, but it's not all that helpful to talk about your plan in retrospect in the context of what you should have done. At that point, you actually want some feedback on the quality of what you've done. So those kinds of things can shift across a career trajectory too. And then another kind of feedback that I think we all need is negotiation, career management kind of feedback. And that has to do maybe with someone who has professional experience, but not necessarily in your field. So that's a different kind of mentoring, and it's equally valuable. It can be very important. It might have to do with a particular decision, or it might just be in general, what do I do? And that's a conversation that you have with someone you trust periodically. And then I also mentioned work-life balance. I think regardless of what you're balancing, it's really nice to get support, feedback from people who have either successfully navigated that challenge or who are in the same situation. So for example, my father moved here and he had medical issues, and I suddenly had not just my own dependents but additional dependents, and that was a strain, and it was very, very helpful to find out about resources and other kinds of things. And that was not something that I had ever imagined that I would need feedback on. So these kinds of things that have to do with your personal life also exist in terms of support on campus, and it's worth seeking out. It's hardly ever the case that you're the only one dealing with whichever struggle that you're dealing with. So there are other sources of feedback and mentoring for that. As I mentioned, peer negotiation. So the point that I want to make with all of these different types of feedback, it's hardly ever the case that there's one person where all of this is accomplished. So it's hardly ever the case pre-tenure, and it would be even more rare, I think, post-tenure, to find a single individual who fulfills every one of these needs for you. That person would not have a career trajectory themselves because they would be solely responsible for your entire life. Most of the time, that can be very suffocating too. So the idea is to start to think about mentoring and mentors in the plural form, and if you know what you need, then you can start to seek the various sources to address each of those issues appropriately, but also not to the extent that you feel compromised or overly connected. And this becomes true, I think, also when you're talking about evaluating your work pre-promotion. Those informal, anonymous reviews that come from off-campus can be very helpful, and they have no effect on your ultimate ability to present yourself for promotion. That may be more comfortable in a lot of cases than asking a senior colleague inside your department. You might save that kind of mentoring as more the plan or how to articulate what you've done, and seek the really critical, focused feedback from people who won't ultimately be involved in your promotion case. You don't have to do that. I did a little of both myself, but it's a perfectly legitimate strategy, particularly if you're concerned that down the road someone might have seen an earlier draft and formed an opinion of your work and it's gotten so much better, but they haven't seen the trajectory. So you might want to save the finished perfect product depending on your relationship with
I
them.
think it is important to get some people to see the early, because the more often they've seen your work, the better they can articulate it at a meeting, and you do need an advocate in your promotion faculty meeting.
We're on our way there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. I completely agree. That's point 3. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, and now I wonder if I should. No, I'm going to wait. So,
Sorry, Kim.
multiple sources of feedback, multiple voices, and Martha's right. People in your unit need to see your work, but if you're not comfortable starting there should be lots of other places where you can get a good hard look. I do think in terms of trajectory and expectations and criteria, probably the best feedback is on campus, if not in your own department, than someone else who's been through the process. In person with formal, informal. Another thing that as associate professors you can do is get really good at identifying informal feedback. So every person who asks a question at a conference or an invited talk, these kinds of things have to do with giving you feedback. It gives you information about what aspects of your work people are responding to, what are they finding interesting, how are they connecting their own work with that, and all of that can become part of your narrative. It doesn't always signal a problem. In fact, it probably signals what's interesting in your field. And so you can start to think about, the contrast between, I get that criticism every time, versus, wow, the people who are most, hello, come on in. The people who are most interested in my work seem to always be working on whatever thing. And that's a nice way to sort of connect your work across fields. And now I've moved to the second set of bullet points. When you think about your career trajectory, and I've added this particularly thinking of the cohort because your end game here is a plan. And integrated in that plan shouldn't just be, I spend this year thinking about it and I go out and do it the next however many years, because sometimes things change, or you might get off track and not realize it in a really great way, or a not so great way. So part of your plan should have checkpoints. And they can be points where you stop and see, am I doing this the way I had planned? Has something changed? Is this a good change? Is it because I had no idea at that time that there was this other avenue that's really exciting? Or have I just gotten kind of lost in the details? Do I need to bring this back to the central focus of where it should be? But if you build into your career plan for the next, I don't know if you're working with about 5 years or more, depends on your field. When are you going to stop and say, how am I doing? And those questions will be different at every stage, so the people that you ask for that feedback should also be different, I think, in most of those cases. The people who can comment on a career-long plan may not be the same people who can say whether this particular grant application looks like it's successful or not, or whether it seems like you've done what your grant funded you to do, or whether you've taken another direction, and these kinds of things. So the next step after you identify what your needs are as a person and as an academic is to lay that out on a timeline. Often it may change. Certainly your life situation changes every few years, and so the kinds of support that you need may not be the same. I think some people work very well if they're being held accountable. So there are peer groups, there are writing groups, and there's an element of accountability built in. You may need to be held accountable more at certain points in your trajectory than others. For example, if you're in the 6 months where you're supposed to write up 2 grant proposals and you sign up for a writing group and you go and you have to work on that proposal and nothing else and tell people that's what you're working on, you'll get it done. And there may be other times where you really need to be in an archive or traveling or in a lab, and the accountability is going to have to come some other form. So the point again is to think about how your needs might change for feedback. Once you've identified all the different kinds and the different sources, probably they shift over time, and there may be really good sources of feedback at some point that aren't so helpful at other points. And then the last point there is to plan ahead, because senior faculty are in varying degrees busy and in varying degrees responsive. But if someone told Martha, I need you to take a look at this article in October, I'll have a draft to you by September, she can say, okay, great, send it your way when it's May. It's really hard to get someone to give you great feedback on your grant application the week before it's due. And this just comes with the territory, right? But if you know when you're going to need the feedback and who you'd like to provide it, it's much easier to set that up ahead of time. Moving back to more formal reviews, regardless of the structure of the annual review or the midterm reviews or the pre-promotion reviews that your unit has in its policy or is willing to conduct on your behalf if they don't have a concrete procedure for that, you can also anticipate those types of milestones and know what feedback you need going in, and then prepare better for those things so that they don't all become very stressful or that all of the materials feel like they were pulled together too quickly and when you could have been planning for it all along. So a little bit of planning there, I think, is really important. And then finally, I've listed additional considerations. And what I really mean is key distinctions here. So mentoring is different from advocacy, is different from evaluation. And you probably need all three. A mentor can tell you how to manage something, how to respond to something. They can tell you how to plan ahead. And those are big picture, forward-looking activities. An advocate is often a good mentor who will then be able to help advocate for you when it really matters. So there's an important balance there, because you wouldn't want your only mentor to be someone that you didn't feel you could be completely honest with, but to the extent possible, if you can get some mentoring, and again, if you find multiple needs and multiple sources, that feels a lot less risky, I think. The senior faculty in your department, to the extent that they've been involved in providing feedback and seeing you respond well to it, they walk into meetings, annual reviews, and they advocate. But it's not always the same thing. And so you can separate those as long as they overlap a little bit. And then, yeah?
Yeah,
One other distinction is evaluation. So an annual review is not necessarily mentoring. The conversation after an annual review could provide a good deal of very constructive mentoring, but an annual review is, how did you do? It's important, it's evaluation, it's feedback, but it's not the same thing unless you start to connect all of these different dots. It can be when done well, but it's different because it's not necessarily forward-looking. So the other distinction there is that you do want reviews, you want to know where you stand, but if you have the opportunity to follow up on an evaluative activity of any sort and turn it into mentoring, so what would you recommend the next steps be? That's a really nice addition that isn't always inherent in the process. Usually, annual review letters are the kinds of things that go in files. They're not really explicit on purpose. They don't want to pin you into a particular point, but they may say, this journal's fantastic. So then the mentoring conversation comes, okay, I have 5 articles and you mentioned this journal. Should I try and go there again? Or are you saying that that's the one you recognize the most, but the others are good? You can ask specific questions about future direction based on the perceived advice that's probably not articulated really clearly in the annual review documents or conversation. And that's going to depend unit to unit. But I think if you go into evaluative experiences with an eye on turning it into a mentoring follow-up, it feels a lot healthier all along. You'll get something valuable out of it by knowing that there's a second step. And people are willing, but you may have to sort of guide the conversation. And then the final distinction I wanted to make is that Community is different from feedback, is different from accountability. And this is another area where I think you might sometimes get that from 3 different people. So a mentor doesn't have to provide community. You don't even really have to like them very well. And you certainly don't need to make it revolve around a meal or a coffee every time. You might get a lot of really valuable feedback from someone that you really only spend a few minutes with, but they're careful and they give good advice. And so if you go looking for the person that you like the best or that you're most comfortable, you might cheat yourself out of some good mentoring. And if you distinguish that from community, you also need community. You can't interact only with people who are only available for 10 minutes and think very clearly about your career but don't know you as a person. You need both, but it doesn't have to fall into the same person. And I think sometimes it's better if it doesn't. It will feel less personal if you put your mentoring here and your community there. And then accountability, I've added as something different also because I think that mentors who give good feedback may or may not hold you accountable for what you say the next step is, and that might be better sought elsewhere too. So a peer group is a perfect place to hold yourself accountable. The writing groups are one example, the faculty success programs are another example, but I know on one of my sabbaticals I just had a chart and I forced myself to write down what I did each week. And that holds you accountable because if there's nothing to write, then you think, oh, I really need to fix the patterns of behavior here. However it works to hold yourself accountable, there are computer programs actually that will lock you out of all of the social media and email and force you to work just on what you're writing for a period of time. So, you know, there's anonymous accountability and there's peer group accountability, and it's all important, but your mentor may not do that, and that's okay. And I think that gets back to the idea that pre-tenure, it may be the case that people look just to their chair. How am I doing? I said I'd do this, look, I've done it. And now, at probably always, but especially at the associate rank, you'll probably be better served to find all of these things in different places and really get what you need. And you know where your strengths and weaknesses are and what kinds of things would be most helpful. You know, your community can come from an exercise class. It doesn't have to be at all related to work, provided that you don't need for it to be. So those are decisions that you make. I will stop. Martha, did you want to add anything?
I think the main thing I would add about accountability is that I think there's this tendency we're all raised to have to be responsible for ourselves and do all these things. And when someone talks to me about accountability, my first knee-jerk reaction is, get off my back, I'm doing it right. And but I have a friend who, I've had periods in my career where I've really struggled with motivation for one reason or another. And I remember having a friend who was a therapist say to me, yeah, this is quite typical in academia because unlike most other fields, you're having to provide the motivation yourself almost all the time. And it does get harder with time. And so I think it can be more important to find ways to help yourself stay focused. So I think it's actually at the associate professor point of your career is a time to seek that out more if you don't already have a habit of seeking it out.
And particularly if you are not a joiner, as I am not, it's a huge hurdle to, I didn't take an exercise class till I was way over 30, and it was only because I had to. I wasn't a joiner, so it took a long time to find these connections, but it gets to a point where it's really hard to stay focused. It takes a lot of energy. Do you all have questions? We went from very formal procedure, here's what your chair should be doing and is hearing, to here's how to find community in a peer group. And I know that many of you are involved in all sorts of peer groups already, so you probably are more expert on that than I am.
I have a question about the resources, and it's a question I've had for a while. So I was tenured in 2013, and I've always noticed that there are the workshops, so now you've gotten tenure, so now what? And then there's the workshop that happens like right before you go up for promotion, but there's not much in between. And there's a real need to know like what benchmarks or what you should be doing along the way,
You're
right?
absolutely right.
I mean, I know my,
Um,
my field is a book field, so I mean, I know that, but that's just one small piece,
And
right?
I think that makes it even harder
Yeah.
because you have this one project and you know, in the middle you think, well, I'm halfway there, so I'm not recently
Great.
tenured and I'm not ready to go. And you know,
Yeah.
I have noticed
Mhm.
that from those chair chats, and we've kind of joked about it, I have an almost 100% follow-up rate because a chair will say, I have a person who would really like to come talk with you. And then we do one-on-one consultations. The invitations for those workshops don't exclude anyone. So recently tenured includes about 3 years, and then pre-promotion is whenever you want to after that, but it starts coming sort of around year 4 or 5. But that's not really the point you're making. The point you're making is there's this giant gap
Yeah.
in between.
But
Now,
still.
at the level of your unit, there should be some kind of feedback, but that really differs
Yeah.
from one place to another.
Yeah.
So in mine, you have to request the annual review if you want it formalized in any way. But yeah, come to us. We're happy to sit down and talk about trajectories. It's so much more fun to talk about whether someone should go up on excellence in research or a balanced case when we're a few years out, and the person is saying, I do all of these things, and sometimes there's this great narrative, and they all connect, and it's just a matter of a little more of everything, and sometimes you think, okay, if you're gonna meet the bar for very good, you have 2 areas that are already very good, and one that you're gonna need to develop a little bit more to make that case. So a mid-career check-in with us, with your chair, is always good. And we've been noticing with shifting focus from Office of Women's Affairs, for example, to multiple different points. Some people have lost the feeling that there's a clearinghouse. We're happy to connect you with whatever kind of group and feedback, and we're working to make that a little bit more visible and a little more obvious, because I think right now people do feel sort of like you're just stuck in that gap between the two.
I haven't thought this through because it just came to mind during listening. But I'm kind of wondering, you know, pre-tenure there was a 3rd-year review process. So I'm kind of wondering what are the, I mean, think of benefits, but I'm also trying to be critical of what are the cons of perhaps creating a 3rd-year review or 4th, whatever year, trajectory review where you invite, you know, 2 to 3 full professors in your unit to review a very small portion of your work in your CV. Can you think of cons? Like, the only thing I was thinking, like, what if they gave you advice and you didn't follow it?
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting that you mentioned the timing. There are lots of those kinds of reviews, but they're usually pre-promotion reviews, and the outcome is whether you're ready or not. And what's tricky is if the answer is no, because they want you to do something else and that was not your intended plan, then you're kind of stuck. So it makes a lot more sense, as you say, to do this sort of 3 years in. How am I doing? If I'm halfway there, what does that look like? And I think it's a good idea. I can't think of what might be problematic, provided you had some selection conversations with the chair and that it was intended to be formative feedback. And it might start working toward this advocate role, because people would know your work and they would say, well, when we talked 3 years ago, you know, it looked great and we just needed to see a little more of this, and look, I told her go out and get these 2 more journal articles and there they are. So it can be helpful. Probably if you requested one and it wasn't required, you might see if you could add a statement that includes not just what you've done, but where you intend to go. And that might give them a chance to talk about trajectory, but in maybe a little more controlled sort of way. So I think you'd want to guide your reader. I don't know, and I think you'd want to focus them not on a subset of your work, but on your work and your career trajectory in rank. And the reason I say that is because if you're in a journal-driven field, and you've already published it in a good journal, you don't need their review of it, because what you really want them to say is, this journal has a 10% acceptance rate, it must be good. So you don't want to duplicate what you've already accomplished, and probably it was already reviewed by people who are more close to that work area than someone who's in your department. But to get someone to look at your trajectory and what you've produced and comment on your plans for getting to the next step makes great sense.
I think it's also important to talk to them about how it all fits together, because that's what you're not getting if you're in a journal area. That's what you're not getting in an individual paper review. And so when your colleagues who are farther away from this, maybe they look at your papers, maybe they just look at where they were published. But you need to have someone who can explain, hey, this person has this overall vision, and there are 3 areas that they're working on to get there, and here's how they're related, and here's what they've accomplished since in rank.
And here's how they're different from the pre-tenure
Right.
portfolio. Absolutely.
And the annual reviews and all that stuff doesn't go in the package, right? So
Never.
that's
No,
never.
it shouldn't. It shouldn't. Those should be internal.
So that mitigates the risk, I think, quite a bit.
Yeah.
So I'd like to follow up on the question about annual reviews in a department where this is not formalized. I was wondering the idea of the annual review, whether it's good to have mentoring feedback on where you are. At the same time, if it's formalized, what is the use of the review itself, and how does it work for you, or for you when you come up for promotion? And a related question is this on the shoulder of the department chair? And if the department chair is himself or herself not a full professor, how easy is it to be done, and how useful would that information be for you?
Right. So, yeah, I'll take the second one first because it's quicker, I think. And then you might have to remind me what the first one was. But with the second one, if your chair is an associate professor, the burden administratively may still be on that individual, but that includes requesting that a full professor in the department, or maybe even in an allied department with very small units, perform the review and create a report, and that's if it's formalized. They could also serve in a department where there's an informal annual review. They could also ask a senior faculty member to look at your CV, meet and talk with you, and then provide an email report of the conversation. Anything that wouldn't then come as evaluative from your chair, because it shouldn't. You shouldn't be evaluated in that way by peers. So I don't know if I answered that, but they shouldn't be writing a report, but they can still be the one to initiate a request.
Yeah.
And I think that can be helpful, right, if you're not getting the kind of feedback that you want. In terms of informal versus formal, if you're getting what you need, it probably doesn't matter, because it's not cumulative and it shouldn't move forward. It's not going to go on the dossier. Some departments also have salary reviews by a peer committee. That might tell you quite a bit about how your work is being perceived or not perceived, and it's a whole picture. Or it might not tell you anything at all, depending on the unit procedures. If you have an informal conversation, but someone is thoughtful and looking at your work and commenting on it, and you are gaining something from the conversation, then maybe that's okay. The times that you want to push for something more formal are if, for example, your chair says, looks great, and you think, which parts? And so the only way you can get concrete feedback is to ask for something in writing, or to ask for a committee to take a look. Then those can be more helpful, simply because it pushes them to do a different kind of mentoring. The other point, if you don't have any formalized annual reviews, you should get at least one before you go up for promotion, because you want to push people to take a serious look and say at least whether you're ready or not. I think that's probably later than is ideal. But I wouldn't want to go into the meeting where they're voting on my case and never have had a conversation or never be evaluated by anyone who's making that decision. And it gets back to advocacy, but I also think sometimes there's very simple feedback that may not even have to do with additional work. It may be that you needed a statement to tell, look, I know you're out of my field, but this is completely different from my pre-tenure work. Or these articles are related in this way, and you say so explicitly. Those things, if they're missed, could result in an annual review that's not helpful and not as positive as it might be.
I think we don't require a document in our department, and I think it's a mistake. You really have to, our policy is associate professors are evaluated every other year, which I actually think is kind of nice, because you probably don't need, it's nice to not feel like having to go through this damn meeting that you hated as an assistant professor. And maybe your units are nicer than mine, but boy, I never liked those meetings. But I think, so I think in the same way that I feel like requirements for graduate students should not exist unless they're doing their part is actually helpful, even if the faculty don't do what they're supposed to do. And I think the same thing is actually true of annual reviews. If you spend the time to sit down and write a statement about what you're doing, that time's useful for you. I think it will result in you getting better advice, but it's useful for you even if you don't get good advice.
Yeah, that's a good
Afterwards,
point.
it just provides some structure.
You may be also able to capitalize on the work you do for an annual review and turn it into, maybe it's an award nomination, an application, a grant application. Maybe there's something on campus that requires a teaching statement. So you work carefully on the teaching statement, but then that folds into your, what have I done in this part of my career language. And so you're working on careful language about who you are and what you do, and you might be able to capitalize on the effort, both immediately and in the long term. It's true, I come from a department that's really, really review heavy with lots of materials, lots of feedback. And so I think probably that's healthy, but I wouldn't know it any other way. So it feels like a lot sometimes.
I think if they require
every
every
other
other
year
year,
is
they're more
great.
likely to do it.
I think that's the right balance there.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the every year when you have several pre-tenure and then several associate professors, even in writing, people aren't being as thoughtful as they could because there's so many. Other questions? How many of you have formalized annual review processes in your units? One. Yeah. So you'll have to figure out what do you need and where are you going to get it? Some of that's formal, but I think a lot of it can come from other sources too.
So it's been 4 years since I secured my tenure, but I'm not sure whether when should I prepare for promotion. I have to wait until chair says something. Or
No. Some chairs are great about saying, hey, I think you're ready to go, and some chairs won't think to say it. So absolutely not. No. You should ask your chair to have a conversation, or ask, is there an annual review, or ask how am I doing, you know, whatever is comfortable with you and whatever works in your unit. But I think some very wonderful, well-meaning chairs may just not think to say, hey, are you ready? And what we're finding is that it comes from a good place sometimes. They don't want to put pressure on people. They don't want us, they feel, as many people probably do, you got tenure, you're allowed to breathe now. And so I think people are hesitant to push too hard or to be too nosy. So it's a great idea to ask. And you might ask, if you have a senior faculty member who's in your same area, you might ask that person to sit and talk with you and the chair. Or you might ask, would they have a conversation about your progress with you? Or, you know, it sort of depends on how big the unit, how many people are in fields where they'd be in a position to evaluate you well. But I think it's a great idea to ask for some feedback. And in that case, sort of formal feedback in the sense that it's within your unit and that sort of thing. It doesn't have to be an annual review with a written report if that's not what they're able to do. But a conversation, I think, would be very useful. Yeah, otherwise, you just wait. And what we find is some people wait way too long. Or some people are working very hard at something that the rest of their department doesn't know how to value. And so those conversations about what you're doing really do serve also to sort of educate people about what you're working on, and they can give you guidance on how to present it and make sure people appreciate the hard work.